Scott paused. That was a joke. Nick stared at the little display of silver frames. Since Laura's death last year, he cared about two things only: his job and his kids. Julia was 10, and she beamed with her 1,000-watt smile in her school picture, her curly chestnut hair unruly, her enormous liquid brown eyes sparkling, her big new teeth a little crooked, a smile so unself-conscious and dazzling she seemed to be bursting out of the photo. Lucas was 16, dark-haired like his little sister, and unnervingly handsome. He had his mother's cornflower blue eyes, an angular jawline, a high school heartthrob. Lucas smiled for the camera, a smile that Nick hadn't actually seen in person since the accident. There was just one photo of all four of them, sitting on the porch of the old house, Laura seated in the middle, everyone touching her, hands on her shoulder or her waist, the center of the family. The gaping hole now. Her amused, twinkling blue eyes looked right at the camera, her expression frank and poised, seemingly tickled by some private joke. And, of course, Barney, their overweight, lumbering, golden lab mix, sat on his haunches in front of everyone, smiling his dog smile. Barney was in all the family pictures, even in last Christmas's family photo, the one with Lucas glowering like Charles Manson. Todd Muldaur's going to have a shit fit, Nick said, lifting his eyes to meet Scott's. Muldaur was a general partner in Fairfield Equity Partners in Boston, the private equity firm that now owned the Stratton Corporation. Todd, not to put too fine a point on it, was Nick's boss. That's about the size of it, Scott agreed. He turned his head suddenly, and a second later Nick heard the shouts too. What the hell? Scott said. A deep male voice somewhere nearby, yelling. A woman's voice sounded like Marge's. You don't have an appointment, sir, Marge was shouting, her voice high and frightened. An answering rumble, the words indistinct. He isn't here anyway, and if you don't leave right this instant, sir, I'm going to have to call security. A hulking figure crashed into one of the silver panels that outlined Nick's workstation, almost tipping it over. A bearded giant in his late 30s wearing a checked flannel shirt, unbuttoned, over a black Harley-Davidson t-shirt. Barrel-chested, powerful-looking. The guy looked vaguely familiar. A factory worker? Someone who'd recently been laid off? Immediately behind him followed Marge, her arms flailing. You cannot come in here, she shrilled. Get out of here immediately or I'll call security. The giant's foghorn voice boomed. Well, what do you know? There he is. Boss man himself. The slasher is in. Nick felt a cold fear wash over him as he realized that the budget meeting might turn out to be the high point of his day. The guy, probably a worker just laid off in the most recent round of cuts, was staring, wild-eyed. Nick flashed on news stories he'd read about crazed employees. Disgruntled workers, they were always called, who'd been let go and then showed up at work and started picking people off. I just remembered a phone conference I'm late for, Scott McNally muttered as he squeezed past the intruder. If you'll excuse me. Nick got up slowly, raised himself to his full 6'2". The crazy bearded guy was considerably bigger. What can I do for you? Nick asked politely, calmly, the way you might try to lull a rabid Doberman pinscher. What can you do for me? That's fucking hilarious. There's nothing more you can do for me or to me, asshole. Marge, hovering directly behind him, her hands flailing, said, Nick, I'll call security. Nick put up his hand to tell her to hold off. I'm sure there's no need, he said. Marge squinted at him to indicate her strong disagreement, but she nodded, backed away warily. The bearded man took a step forward, puffing up his massive chest, but Nick didn't budge. There was something primal going on here. The interloper was a baboon baring his canines, screaming and strutting to scare off a predator. He smelled of rancid sweat and cigar smoke. Nick fought the strong temptation to deck the guy, but reminded himself that, as CEO of Stratton, he couldn't exactly do stuff like that. Plus, if this was one of the 5,000 Stratton workers who'd been laid off within the last 2 years, he had a right to be angry. The thing to do was to talk the guy down, let him vent, let the air out of the balloon slowly. Nick pointed to an empty chair, but the bearded man refused to sit. "What's your name?" Nick said, softening his voice a bit. "Old man DeVries would have never had to ask," the man retorted. "He knew everyone's name." Nick shrugged. That was the myth, anyway. Folksy, paternal Milton DeVries, Nick's predecessor, had been CEO of Stratton for almost 4 decades. The old man had been beloved, but there was no way he knew 10,000 names. "I'm not as good with names as the old man was," Nick said. "So help me out here." "Louis Goss." Nick extended his hand to shake, but Goss didn't take it. Instead, Goss pointed a stubby forefinger at him. "When you sat down at your fancy computer at your fancy desk and made the decision to fire half the guys in the chair factory, did you even fucking think about who these people are?" "More than you know," Nick said. "Listen, I'm sorry you lost your job." "I'm not here because I lost my job. See, I got seniority. I'm here to tell you that you deserve to lose yours. You think just because you waltz through this plant once a month that you know anything about these guys? These are human beings, buddy. 450 men and women who get up at 4 in the morning to do the early shift so they can feed their families and pay their rent or their mortgages and take care of their sick kids or their dying parents, okay? Do you realize that because of you, some of these guys are going to lose their houses?" Nick closed his eyes briefly. "Louis, are you just going to talk at me, or do you want to hear me out?" "I'm here to give you a little free advice, Nick." "I find you get what you pay for." The man ignored him. "You better think seriously about whether you really want to go through with these layoffs. Because if you don't call them off by tomorrow morning, this place is going to grind to a halt." "What are you trying to say?" "I got half, maybe 3/4 of the factory floor with me on this. More once we start. We're all sicking out tomorrow, Nick. And we're staying sick until my buddies get their jobs back." Goss was smiling with tobacco-darkened teeth, enjoying his moment. "You do the right thing, we do the right thing. Everyone's happy." Nick stared at Goss. How much of this was bluster? How much on the level? A wildcat strike could paralyze the company, especially if it spread to the other plants. "Why don't you think this over when you're driving home tonight in your Mercedes to your gated community?" Goss went on. "Ask yourself if you feel like taking your company down with you." "It's a Chevy Suburban, not a Mercedes," Nick wanted to say, but then he was struck by that phrase, gated community. How did Goss know where he lived? There'd been nothing in the newspaper about that, though, of course, people talked. Was this a veiled threat? Goss smiled. A mirthless, leering grin saw the reaction on Nick's face. "Yeah, that's right. I know where you live." Nick felt his rage flare up like a lit match tossed into a pool of gasoline. He sprang out of his seat, lunged forward, his face a few inches from Louis Goss's face. "What the hell are you trying to say?" It took all his self-restraint to keep from grabbing the collar of the guy's flannel shirt and twisting it tight around his fat neck. Up close, he realized